Look at the baseline of our modern reality: global satellite networks, instant digital connectivity, and human engineering consistently breaking into orbit. Now imagine rewriting a single line in a courtroom ledger. In 1924, following a failed coup in Munich, the Bavarian officials seriously considered deporting Adolf Hitler to Austria as an undesirable foreigner. If they had, he would have been permanently barred from German political life. The immediate relief of this decision is obvious. The Third Reich never forms. The industrialized genocide of the Holocaust is averted. Tens of millions of people who perished in the deadliest conflict in human history get to live out their natural lives. But remove that conflict, and the specific pressures that forced our modern world into existence disappear. The technological leaps and global alliances we take for granted are never commissioned. The institutions we rely on today don't have a reason to form. We are forced to confront an uncomfortable paradox. So much of the modern world was forged under the brutal urgency of a global war. Achieving an earlier peace carries an enduring, hidden cost. Erasing one radical leader does not erase a nation's underlying trauma. The Treaty of Versailles still leaves a defeated Germany deeply humiliated. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression still guts the economy, leaving nearly a third of German workers completely unemployed and desperate. Even before that crash, hyperinflation had already wiped out an entire generation's savings, reducing the national currency to literal playthings. National resentment and economic collapse create a vacuum. A general, an industrialist, or another radical voice steps in. Fascism was already gaining traction in Italy and Spain, entirely independent of Germany. And geopolitical friction is not confined to Europe. Across the globe, Japan's imperial expansion throughout Asia continues on its own track. A large-scale Pacific conflict, likely drawing in the United States, remains highly probable. The tinder was already stacked. Hitler exploited a crisis that already existed. Without him, the systemic conditions still spark a conflict, though the scale and ideology might shift. This chart shows standard historical technological progression over the last century. Notice the sudden exponential spike right here, between 1939 and 1945. The existential threat of total war forcefully compressed decades of theoretical innovation into just a few frantic years. Without that brutal urgency, aerospace acceleration stalls. The state-level investment required to develop early ballistic missiles dries up, delaying the foundational engineering needed for space exploration. Early electromechanical computing faces a similar bottleneck. These complex, room-sized machines were funded explicitly to break enemy military codes. Without a war to demand them, their development loses its critical backing. Even medical breakthroughs slow down. The mass, industrialized production of antibiotics like penicillin was driven entirely by the desperate need to treat millions of wounded soldiers on the front lines. These inventions do not vanish from history entirely, but spreading their development across 50 years of peacetime friction slows the momentum of the 20th century. The physical map of Europe also freezes. Without a post-war partition splitting the continent, the Iron Curtain never descends, and a concrete wall never physically divides Berlin. The European Union might never form. It was historically designed to bind European economies together, making future continental wars impossible. Without the memory of a destroyed Europe, that unifying mandate doesn't exist. Global governance bodies like the United Nations would lack the unified post-war authority that shaped their real-world influence. The global balance of power remains fragmented. This map shows the migration of elite minds across the Atlantic. Nazi persecution drove brilliant scientists to the United States. Without that persecution, that talent stays in Europe. America's rise as a scientific superpower stalls, keeping the research center firmly in Europe. We are left with a world that successfully avoids a 6-year global slaughter, but inherits a stagnant, fractured, and technologically delayed society. And the darkest caveat remains: anti-Semitism and persecution were deeply embedded across European society long before 1933. Without a centralized regime industrializing it, the violence doesn't disappear. It remains scattered and uncounted, losing its historical name but keeping its victims. We look at the sheer scale of ruined infrastructure from our timeline and weigh it against the unbuilt innovations of a peaceful alternate century. It forces us to ask whether history's darkest chapters are truly written by isolated individuals acting alone. The toxic societal conditions, the economic collapse, the search for a scapegoat, they were already at a boil. They were simply waiting for a spark.